January 7th, 1942, the Pacific Ocean, 400 miles west of Hawaii. Lieutenant Masaharu Koyama rolled his Mitsubishi A6M20 into a perfect Immelman turn, watching below as the American fighter struggled to match him. Through his goggles, the Grumman F4F Wildcat looked exactly like what Japanese pilots had nicknamed it, mongrel dog. Stubby wings, fixed landing gear hanging like dead weight, a barrel fuselage that seemed to wallow through the air. Koyama's wingman had just flamed one of these clumsy machines in a single pass. Now Koyama selected his own target, a Wildcat flown by a young American named James Sutherland. The Zero pilot pushed his throttle forward, feeling the lightweight fighter surge with 500 horsepower. This would be quick. Sutherland saw him coming. He saw the rising sun on the fuselage, the glint of the two 20mm cannons in the wings. Every instinct screamed at him to break left, to dive, to do anything but fly straight and level while this deadly machine closed on his tail. But Sutherland held his course. He held it because a quiet Texan had drilled something into him that violated every fighter pilot's instinct, something that would soon have a name, something that would change everything. First, we need to understand the weapons themselves, not as machines, but as expressions of two opposing philosophies of war. The Mitsubishi A6M0 represented the pinnacle of Japanese aeronautical thinking. Engineer Jiro Horikoshi had been given a simple, impossible mission: create a fighter that could fly 2,000 miles without refueling. Arm it with the heaviest guns possible. Make it so maneuverable that no enemy aircraft could escape, and above all, make it light. Every gram was shaved away. The Zero had no armor plate around its cockpit. Its fuel tanks were simple aluminum boxes, not self-sealing. Its wings were so thin and light that ground crews could flex them with their hands. But in the air, those wings became a samurai sword. Below 270 miles per hour, the Zero could turn inside any opponent, climb like a rocket, and dive like a falcon. Its two 20mm cannons fired explosive shells that could shatter an enemy fighter in one burst. The Zero was a sword, pure, elegant, deadly in the hands of a master. The Grumman F4F Wildcat was something else entirely. Engineer Leroy Grumman had built his reputation on rugged, reliable aircraft. His company was called the Grumman Iron Works for a reason. When the Navy asked for a carrier fighter, Grumman had different priorities. The Wildcat would be armored. Its cockpit would be wrapped in 212 pounds of steel plate. Its fuel tanks would self-seal, closing around bullet holes like living flesh. Its air-cooled radial engine could take hits that would shatter the Zero's liquid-cooled power plant. The Wildcat weighed nearly 2,000 pounds more than the Zero. That weight was its curse, and its salvation. The Wildcat could not outturn the Zero. It could not outclimb it. Its four 50-caliber machine guns were effective, but lacked the explosive punch of the Zero's cannons. The Wildcat's only advantages were its diving speed and its ability to absorb punishment like a sponge. It was not a sword, it was a shield, a Roman legionnaire's scutum, heavy, unlovely. But in the right hands, it could become something more. Now, the man who saw the pattern, John Smith Thach. Born in Texas, 1905. Learned to fly when barnstorming was still a spectacle, and carrier aviation was science fiction. By 1940, he commanded Fighting Squadron 3, based at San Diego. Thach was not a flamboyant ace. He was a teacher, an analyst, a man who studied air combat like poetry, looking for rhythm and structure where others saw only chaos. Thach had seen the gun camera films. He'd watched Zero after Zero slice through American formations like a scythe. He'd listened to surviving pilots describe the terror of seeing a Zero materialize on their tail, its wings flashing, its cannons winking with deadly light. The Japanese had perfected the boom and zoom. High-speed attacks from above, then vertical climbs that left American fighters wallowing below like fish in a barrel. Most American commanders responded with what they knew. Climb higher. Fly faster. Pray. Thach saw something else. He saw that the Zero's greatest strength created its weakness. To turn that tightly, it had to fly slowly. To climb that steeply, it had to trade speed for altitude. The Zero was master of the vertical plane. But what if American pilots refused to fight there? What if they forced the Zero into a different geometry? The answer came from an unlikely source. The Spanish Civil War. The Luftwaffe's Condor Legion had survived against more agile Soviet fighters by weaving back and forth across each other's paths. Two aircraft moving in opposition could cover each other's blind spots. Each pilot became the other's eyes. Each became the other's guardian. But the German rotor was too slow, too predictable. Thach needed something faster. Something that would work against the Zero's specific tactics. He retreated to a chalkboard in his ready room and began drawing vectors, lines of attack, lines of defense. He saw it then. Not a circle, but a figure eight. Two pairs of aircraft, weaving across each other's tails in a rhythmic dance. If a Zero latched onto one Wildcat's tail, the second Wildcat would be perfectly positioned for a deflection shot. The Zero pilot would have a choice: break off his attack, or fly straight into a hail of 50 caliber bullets. Thach called it the beam defense position. His pilots would call it something else, the Thach weave. Teaching the weave was like teaching a man to walk while juggling fire. It violated every fighter pilot instinct. When an enemy latched onto your tail, every nerve screamed for you to break left, break right, climb, dive. Thach was asking his pilots to do something counterintuitive, to fly straight, to hold course, to trust. The first training sessions at San Diego were disasters. Pilots would start the weave, see a Zero in their practice runs, and break formation. Thach would land, gather them in the ready room, and draw the vectors again. "You're not flying alone anymore," he would say, his Texas drawl giving weight to each word. "You're part of a machine with 4 wings and 8 guns. The Zero is trying to kill one part of that machine, but the machine is trying to kill him." It took 3 weeks of constant drilling. Day after day, Thach's Wildcats crisscrossed the California sky in their strange rhythmic pattern. Other squadrons watched and laughed. Thach's square dance, they called it. A waste of time, a gimmick. But Thach persisted. He refined the timing. The ideal separation was 200 to 250 yards. The weave took exactly 8 seconds to complete one full cycle. Any faster and pilots would lose sight of each other. Any slower and the Zero could exploit the gaps. He taught them to watch for the flash, that moment when sunlight caught the Zero's wing as it rolled in for the kill. He taught them to communicate with the briefest radio calls. Break left. Clear right. He taught them to trust their wingman's fire as much as their own. By April of 1942, Fighting Squadron 3 was ready. But the Navy, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, was skeptical. The weave was untested. It was theoretical. It was, some senior officers whispered cowardly, a defensive maneuver when America needed offensive spirit. Then came June 4th, Midway, the day the sky became a classroom. 900 miles northwest of Hawaii, the Japanese carrier force steamed toward what Admiral Yamamoto hoped would be the decisive battle. The Americans, thanks to broken codes, were waiting. At 10:25 that morning, Thach Squadron launched from the Yorktown. Their mission was combat air patrol, protecting the carrier from Japanese attack. Thach led 6 Wildcats, flying in 2 3-plane divisions. They climbed to 20,000 feet and began the weave. The Japanese strike force appeared at 10:48. 43 Zeros led by Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano. The Japanese pilots saw the American formation and smiled. Another chance to demonstrate their superiority. Miyano selected his target, a Wildcat flown by Lieutenant Edward O'Hare, who would later become America's first fighter ace of the war. Miyano rolled his Zero into a high-side attack, diving from 25,000 feet, building speed to 400 miles per hour. He closed rapidly, his cannons tracking the Wildcat's rhythmic path. Thach saw him coming. He spoke calmly into his radio. "Execute Thach weave, now." The Wildcats didn't scatter. They tightened their weave, reducing the cycle from 8 seconds to 6. The figure 8 became a blur of crossing paths. Miyano fired at 200 yards. His shells passed through empty air where the Wildcat should have been. Because at that instant, The Weave brought another Wildcat across his flight path. Lieutenant William Butch Davenport opened fire. The tracers walked across Miyano's Zero. Engine, cockpit, tail. The aircraft disintegrated, its light structure unable to absorb the punishment. Miyano never ejected. Japanese aircraft had no ejection seats. The battle became a classroom in the sky. Zero after zero fell to the Weave. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, one of Japan's leading aces, attacked a Wildcat pair, only to find himself bracketed by crossing fire. He broke off, a move that saved his life but cost him his attack position. Itaya landed on the carrier Hiryu and reported what he had seen. American pilots are flying a new defensive pattern. It is highly effective. We are losing many aircraft to their wingmen. By noon, the Japanese had lost 21 Zeros. American losses were 3 Wildcats. More importantly, the Japanese had failed to break through to the American carriers. The dive bombers and torpedo planes they were supposed to protect had been slaughtered. The Thach Weave had not just saved lives, it had changed the course of the battle. To understand why it worked, we must understand what the Zero pilot saw, or failed to see. The Zero's cockpit was designed for lightness. It had no rear armor. Its canopy, while offering excellent forward vision, had blind spots directly to the rear and below. The Japanese counted on maneuverability to compensate. A Zero pilot could simply roll his aircraft to check his 6 o'clock low position. But that roll took time. And in the Weave, time was the one thing the Japanese never had. When a Zero latched onto a Wildcat's tail, the American pilot would call out his position. The second element of the Weave, flying 200 yards away and 200 yards behind, would be crossing on a reciprocal heading. From the Zero pilot's perspective, this second Wildcat would appear as a flash of motion in his peripheral vision. By the time he processed the threat, by the time he started his roll to evade, his aircraft was already flying through the bullet stream. The geometry was ruthless. The Zero's greatest advantage, its tight turning radius, became its doom. To stay on the Wildcat's tail, the Zero had to turn. But the Weave meant that as soon as the Zero turned, the second Wildcat's guns were already tracking his future position. It was like trying to catch a ball while another ball was being thrown at your head. You could have one or the other, not both. The Wildcats. 50 caliber machine guns had an effective range of 800 yards. The Zero's cannons were devastating but had a slower rate of fire and were most effective inside 200 yards. The Weave kept the Zero at the worst possible distance. Too close to escape, too far to guarantee a kill. And there was one more factor. Psychology. The Japanese pilot was trained for the single, perfect kill. The Bushido Code, adapted for air combat, demanded aggression, individual skill, and absolute confidence. Breaking off an attack to evade a wingman was tantamount to cowardice. Many Zero pilots simply refused to do it. They rode their attacks all the way into the American guns. The news spread through the Japanese carrier force like a virus. American pilots were no longer easy kills. They were flying a tactic that negated the Zero's advantages. The confidence that had carried Japanese aviators from Pearl Harbor to Singapore began to crack. Chief Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading living ace, encountered the Weave 2 weeks after Midway, over the Solomon Islands. He had 8 kills already. He saw 2 Wildcats, flying that strange crossing pattern, and recognized the threat immediately. Sakai was a pragmatist. He broke off his attack, circling high above, watching the American pair. He noted their timing. 8 seconds. He saw how they communicated with minute wing waggles. He understood the geometry. But understanding and countering were different things. Sakai tried a high-speed dive from above, hoping his speed would let him exit the engagement before the second Wildcat could bring guns to bear. He fired a long-range burst and pulled up violently. The Wildcat he targeted took hits in its armored wing. The second Wildcat's return fire missed Sakai's Zero by inches. The Japanese ace escaped, but he had not scored a kill. For the first time in months, Saburo Sakai returned to his carrier without a victory. In the ready rooms of the Japanese carriers, veterans like Sakai tried to explain the Weave to younger pilots. They drew diagrams. They simulated the maneuver in training flights. But the Japanese system, which prized individual initiative and attack spirit, had no doctrine for teamwork-based defense. The weave required trust. It required discipline. It required pilots to suppress their instinct for individual glory. These were not qualities the Imperial Japanese Navy had cultivated. The Americans, by contrast, embraced the weave completely. By August of 1942, every Wildcat squadron in the Pacific had adopted Thach's tactic. Training films were produced. The weave was demonstrated in congressional hearings. Thach himself was pulled from combat and sent on a tour of American aircraft factories, explaining his creation to riveters and welders who would never sit in a cockpit but whose work had made the Wildcats' armor and guns possible. The statistics of the Pacific Air War reveal a stark transformation. In the first 6 months of the war, from Pearl Harbor to Midway, the kill ratio favored the Japanese by nearly 4-1. For every 0 lost, 4 Wildcats were destroyed. The causes were many. American pilots were inexperienced, tactics were outdated, and the 0 was, as the Japanese claimed, a superior aircraft. But after Midway, after the weave became doctrine, the numbers flipped. From June 1942 to the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, the kill ratio became nearly even, 1-1. And in some months, the Americans actually held a slight advantage. More telling was the survival rate. Wildcat pilots who flew the weave were 3 times more likely to return to their carriers than those who did not. The heavy armor that the Japanese had mocked as excessive weight was now saving lives by the dozen. The self-sealing fuel tanks, which cost the Wildcats speed and range, were allowing pilots to limp home with aircraft that would have been fatal fireballs in a 0. The technical specifications tell part of the story. The 0 weighed 5,600 pounds fully loaded. Its top speed was 331 miles per hour at 14,000 feet. Its wing loading was just 22 pounds per square foot, giving it that legendary maneuverability. Its range was an astonishing 1,900 miles with a drop tank. The Wildcat weighed 7,400 pounds. Its top speed was 318 miles per hour, slightly slower. Its wing loading was 28.6 pounds per square foot. Its range was just 800 miles. On paper, the 0 was the clear winner, but paper doesn't account for armor. The Wildcat had 212 pounds of steel and aluminum alloy protecting the pilot. The 0 had none. Paper doesn't account for self-sealing fuel tanks. The Wildcat had them in each wing and behind the cockpit. The 0's tanks were simple aluminum boxes, rupturing at the first bullet strike. Paper doesn't account for redundant systems. The Wildcat's hydraulics were doubled. Its control cables were armored. In one famous incident, a Wildcat returned to its carrier with 72 bullet holes, its right wing half shot away, its engine coughing oil. The pilot walked away unharmed. No 0 could have survived such damage. The weave exploited these differences mercilessly. It forced the 0 to fight on the Wildcat's terms. Not a dogfight of maneuver, but a geometry problem of crossing fire. It was the aerial equivalent of the Roman testudo formation, where overlapping shields created a wall no individual sword could penetrate. John Thach never claimed to be a genius. He was simply a man who looked at a problem without preconception. But his innovation came at a cost. The weave saved hundreds of American lives, but it also created new pressure on Japanese pilots. Young aviators, taught that their aircraft was invincible, now faced a tactic that made them feel helpless. This psychological shift contributed to ever more reckless attacks, which in turn drove the casualty rate higher. Some Japanese pilots tried to adapt. They flew in pairs, attempting to counter the American pairs, but their aircraft were not built for mutual support. A 0's best defense was not to be hit at all. When they tried to fly the weave themselves, their light structures and lack of armor made them vulnerable to even glancing hits. The maneuver that saved American lives became a death sentence when attempted by Japanese pilots. The weave also changed American pilot training. Before the war, individual marksmanship and aerobatic skill were paramount. After the weave, teamwork became the core curriculum. Pilots were taught to think in pairs, in divisions, in squadrons. The lone wolf ace gave way to the disciplined team player. Richard Bong, America's top ace of the war, flew the Weave religiously. He credited it with allowing him to survive long enough to score his 40 kills. By 1943, the Wildcat was being replaced by the faster, more powerful F4F Hellcat. But the Weave remained. Hellcats, Corsairs, and eventually jets in Korea and Vietnam would use variations of Thach's defensive geometry. The principle was eternal. 2 aircraft, working in perfect coordination, were worth more than 2 aircraft flying alone. The last combat use of the pure Thach Weave came in the Korean War, in the jet age. American F-86 Sabres, facing the nimble Soviet-built MiG-15, revived the old pattern. The jets were too fast for the traditional 8-second cycle, but the principle held. Cross across your wingman's tail. Force the enemy to choose between targets. Let geometry do what raw performance cannot. But the Wildcat and the Zero hold a special place because they were so evenly matched. The Wildcat was not the best fighter of the war. That title belongs to the P-51 Mustang or the F4U Corsair. The Zero was not the worst. It was brilliant in its conception. But it was flawed by a philosophy that valued attack over defense, lightness over survivability. The men who flew them were equally matched in courage. Saburo Sakai survived the war, blind in one eye from a bullet wound, to become a Buddhist priest and a champion of peace. John Thach rose to the rank of admiral and commanded the entire United States 7th Fleet. But in the ready rooms of 1942, they were simply pilots trying to solve the problem of staying alive. The Wildcat's cockpit was cramped and hot. Its canopy had poor visibility. Its controls were heavy. Pilots joked that flying a Wildcat was like wrestling a bear in a phone booth. But they loved it, because it brought them home. The Zero's cockpit was open, airy, with a bubble canopy that gave its pilot a view of the entire sky. It was a joy to fly, responsive and light on the controls, but it was a coffin with wings. The Thach Weave was born from desperation, but it taught a lesson that extends beyond air combat. It taught that humility can be a weapon, that admitting your inferiority in one area can lead to superiority in another, that the best answer to a seemingly unbeatable opponent is not to match their strength, but to change the game entirely. On the morning of September 2nd, 1945, John Thach stood on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. He watched as Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender. The sky above was empty of fighters, Wildcat or Zero. The war was over. Thach would later write that he thought of those early days in the Pacific, of the pilots who had trusted his strange geometry enough to hold their course while Japanese cannons bore down on them, of the moment when fear gave way to understanding, when they realized that the mongrel dog could hunt. The Wildcat was gone from service by 1945. Most were scrapped or sold to Latin American air forces. A few survived as museum pieces, their faded paint and patched bullet holes telling silent stories. The Zero fared even worse. Most were destroyed in the final year of the war, flown by barely trained pilots in kamikaze attacks. The few that remained became trophies, photographed and measured and eventually forgotten. But the Weave lived on. In the training manuals of every air force in the world, in the tactics of every fighter pilot who has ever flown in combat, it is the geometry of survival, the calculus of trust. The Japanese pilots who mocked the Wildcat were not wrong in their assessment. It was heavy, it was slow, it was outdated. But they failed to understand that war is not decided by machines, it is decided by men. Men like John Thach, who saw what others could not, who taught his pilots to weave not just their aircraft, but their fates together. In the endless blue of the Pacific, where so many young men vanished without a trace, the Thach Weave became more than a tactic. It became a promise. That no pilot would die alone, that the sky, so vast and indifferent, could be made safe by the simple, profound act of watching each other's backs. The Wildcat was a shield. The Weave was the arm that held it, and together they proved that the heaviest aircraft, in the right hands and with the right mind behind it, could become light enough to change the world. The Weave is still up there. In every clear sky where fighters fly. In every pilot who learns that his wingman is his truest weapon, it is a pattern of survival, drawn in the air with courage and trust. never to be erased.